Welcome to the People Are People podcast, life lessons learned in real time, where we touch on the crazy realities of dealing with human behavior in the workplace. In 2022, I am presenting a series that I simply call the New Manager Series, where we talk about and will focus on a variety of topics every manager needs to know to be successful during and beyond their first year of management. Being a manager is not always a pretty job. It comes with highs and lows that you must prepare yourself to navigate. In this episode, we are going to discuss how your communication style may affect job satisfaction amongst your employees. Believe it or not, communication is the most influential tool that you as a manager can have at your disposal. Too little of a good thing can lay the foundation for mistrust, poor assumptions, and it can significantly impact the employee rate of satisfaction amongst your team. So in this podcast, I really wanted us to dive into how we use communication, meaning the common methods that we use communication, how it is we should be using communication, talk a little bit about how your communication practices could influence your team, including job satisfaction, and then just kind of close things out with some recommendations for how you can promote effective communication for yourself as well as for your team. So let's start by talking a little bit about, how we use communication, common methods in the workplace. Now, oftentimes as a manager, a lot of the communication that you provide to your team will be centered around a core set of topics, so to speak, right? You may be making announcements about impending changes that are coming. Perhaps you're just making announcements in general, about individuals on the team, about yourself. You may be the individual who has to communicate a specific change that has already happened to your team. Oftentimes managers are used as the voice and the educator for changes that are happening across the organization. Also, you may be the voice, giving information about upcoming changes, what it means for your team directly or indirectly. Additionally, obviously, we have to use communication to share feedback about performance. We often, as managers, have to spend time talking about what it is we're doing well or what we did well on a past project. What are some best practices that we are going to be deploying and moving forward? But we also have to be the voice that is communicating what needs to improve. And we have to do it in a very timely fashion as well so that it can have meaning. We also have to communicate with our frontline staff, right? We talk a lot about career goals, where they are today, where they want to be in 3 to 6 months, a year from now, 3 years from now. We are the voice that provides communication around process clarification. Communication is also used as a means for seeking feedback as it relates to, how things are going from a general perspective or, on the occasion in which we are doing an informal 360 where we're soliciting feedback from our teams about something we have done as managers. So obviously, as you can see, I've kind of rambled here in the beginning, but I wanted to just really emphasize all the different ways that you as a manager may be communicating with your staff. Now, the methods in which you go about doing that can also vary. And this becomes important, right? Because ideally, you want to ensure that your method of communication really aligns with whatever message or decision you are having to convey. So, for example, we often communicate through emails, instant messaging, meetings, of course, that we have virtual meetings that may occur if you're managing virtual teams. There are policies, surveys, blogs. Some managers and leaders actually create podcasts and video recordings to communicate with their teams because they want to, keep it interesting, kind of change things up a little bit, modernize the ways in which they're communicating with their teams. There are many, many ways, right, that we can and should consider releasing information and communicating with our staff. In essence, after hearing all of these things, as you can see, there's really no excuse for not communicating with your team on a regular basis, given the variety of ways in which you can relay information. So how does your communication practices influence your team? Well, consider this. There's tons of research out there today that talks about how much communication can motivate performance on your team. So ideally, you want to ensure that the information that you are providing is consistent and happening on a regular basis. You want to be transparent. Ideally, you have to find a way to communicate good and bad news in a way that helps your team to understand, where things are, whether it's for the organization or for the team, how it affects them, and then what can they do to either support whatever is happening or get their feedback about how they can support, whatever is happening in that moment. But you always want to remember that communication motivates performance. If you're not regularly communicating with your team, it can have a significant impact on trust. Trust is critical for performance, buy-in, engagement. A lot of employees if they feel that you are not being transparent with them and upfront about things that are happening, if you're not keeping them in the loop about what's happening, they can sometimes lose interest in the position. Their level of commitment can drop off. And obviously, you start to experience job satisfaction issues because for some employees, it also translates to how appreciated they feel. The fact that you're not sharing information with them can sometimes lead some individuals to feel that you do not appreciate the work, their work experience, their professional background, their educational background. They can start to feel that you don't appreciate what they bring to the job. Healthy interactions amongst your team, again, regular communication can really help to improve productivity. It can help to ensure that you keep your attrition rate low. Oftentimes people who feel engaged with, everything that's going on, who feel that they have a clear picture of where things stand, are not likely to leave the company. We've talked about this in previous podcasts where, oftentimes salary or money is not the reason why people leave a job. Sometimes it can be leader, manager driven. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a variety of other things. But you should be aware as a manager, as a leader, that communication can be a significant factor as it relates to productivity, how happy they are, and whether or not your staff chooses to stay or leave. So what can you do as a manager, when it comes to communication and providing communication in a way that keeps your employees satisfied? Well, there are many things that you can do. Some of these are things that I have deployed in the past that have allowed me to rank highly, amongst my teams that I've managed when it comes to communication. And you don't have to necessarily do it all yourself. Keep this in mind, okay? So one of the things that you can do is to look for different tools, right? Resources that you can leverage that serve as a form of communication. One of the tools that previously was used on my team was a weekly email update, and I didn't actually manage it. One of the employees on my team managed that communication. She would craft the email each week with various updates because there were things that I had delegated to her, and she would craft basically the framework of the email where she would identify all the things that she was aware of, and then she would reach out to me to find out if there was anything I wanted to add to that communication, as well as kind of a way for me to approve what she was sending out. And the information would go out every Friday. And I would also leverage team meetings to recap some of those communications that had gone out. You always have to account for, I call them different learning styles, honestly, because you have some people who are very visual. And so when they receive the email, they're going to open it, they're going to read it thoroughly, they're going to get what they need from it, and then they're going to be done with it. Other people are going to open the email, read it. It's not going to stick. They're going to close it and they won't know in a few weeks what that email was about. So I also liked to use my team meetings as a summarization or a recap of, what some of those communications were that had gone out, particularly if there were actionable items, right? Things that they either needed to act on within a time frame, or things in the email that might have impacted process changes. I always wanted to make sure that I, had it up on the screen during the meeting and that I was talking about it, and open the floor to questions. Another approach that you can use is, you already heard me talk about the meetings. Use your team meetings as a way to communicate information. If for any reason you're not going to be able to maintain your regularly scheduled meetings, which may happen weekly, bi-weekly, once a month, then you want to make sure again that you are sending out some form of communication. Now, I already talked about this, but you could actually, create a podcast. Obviously it's internal to your team, but you could record something where they're hearing your voice and you're also reviewing something. You can also craft an email that's a little formal and request that people send some type of email back to you acknowledging that they reviewed it. But basically what you're doing is you're setting a pattern, a consistency pattern, and you're laying the foundation of trust for your team that they know that if there was any information for you to share, that you would have communicated it with them in some form. Now, one of the things that you also want to keep in mind is that, I've identified a couple of methods that you can communicate with your team, but you may have to create a few buckets, or I won't say you have to, but you have the option to create a few methods in which you're sending out the communication by buckets. So maybe your informal communication that needs to go out, that's something that you can have an employee on your team doing, as I just kind of gave the example of. Every Friday, you have someone who's sending out some informal information. It's not something that you necessarily have to own. It's just maybe a quick update about something, but you can delegate that and it goes into the informal bucket. For more formal communication, maybe you are the owner of that communication and you have a couple of methods in which you may convey that. It may be that you always convey it via email and via a team meeting. Maybe you have, if it's a policy, that you always post it in a specific location, so a centralized location, so that it's accessible to all of your team. But you can set up buckets, right, for informal, formal, and unofficial. So perhaps for unofficial information that you're sharing with your team, you might consider that it's something that you may not necessarily put in formal writing, but you're giving your team a heads up about something. So maybe you've gotten wind of a change that's coming that may impact them and you just want them to be aware. So you say, hey, I'm just giving you a heads up about X, and we think that it may happen at this point in time. At this time, I have no additional information. I just wanted to give you a heads up. Stay tuned. I will share more information as it becomes available. It's kind of like an unofficial heads up. Again, it's a great way for your team to know that if you have information, you're going to share it with them. Of course, there are going to be times where you may have information and you're just not able to share with your team and they get wind of it elsewhere. That happens. But, for the most part, you always want to be able to share as much information as you can with your team in a formal, informal, unofficial, and or even an official capacity so that they know that you're keeping their best interest at heart. Now, I know that the next statement that I'm about to make, for some of you who are maybe non-feelers out there, it's going to feel hokey and unnecessary, but I have to say this to you. You're going to want to ensure that your communication is in a general positive and motivational sense. Yes, there will always be times in which you have to report bad news about something that's changing within the organization. but you have to look for ways to put a positive spin on it of sorts and motivate your team to keep going. This is something that transformational leaders do really well. But you want to, let's say if you had a new leader coming in and you're switching organizations, it's really up to you to find the positive in that change that's happening, that reorganization that's happening. Of course, I'm not telling you to blow smoke. Obviously that's not necessarily the approach that you want to take either, because you don't want to come across as fake. However, you are the cheerleader for this change. You are the champion of the change. So you have to be able to convey what's happening in a way that is going to motivate your team to get on board, even if you don't like it. Now, if they ask you how you're feeling about it, yes, you can give a straight answer. There's no need for you to not be straightforward about how you're feeling about a change if you're not necessarily in agreement with it. However, you always want to follow that up with a clarification or clarifying point, right? That while you may not be in agreement with what's happening, this is the new mission that you and your team have been given, and here's how you're going to go about doing it. Or, listen, I know you may not agree with this. What are your thoughts for how we can get it done? That is an excellent way to create buy-in and to help people invest in whatever change that's happening. And again, it helps to keep things closer to being on a positive and motivational front. So there you have it. Communication is not an easy beast to tackle. It does take a lot of practice, commitment on your part, consistency, and a willingness to just really bring your team into the fold and have an open conversation. Do not underestimate the impact communication can have on job satisfaction. It has a direct correlation with job satisfaction. So make sure that you purposefully make a hefty investment in the area of communication. That does it for this episode of the People Are People podcast, Life Lessons Learned in Real Time. I am your host, Lexi Mahari. Please stay safe out there, and I'll catch you in the next podcast.